are talking today about a topic that's very relevant, I think, because most people are looking into this particular pathway, and that is migration. And we have with us a consultant on migration all the way from Australia. He is the Australian Director of Migration and Citizenship, and he's the go-to person that we need to speak to when it comes to this migration process. So Peter, we've been speaking now about the first few steps that you have to take when it comes to migration to Australia. I think you've given a lot of the prerequisites that are required, but let me go back to the problem that we have here even in Sri Lanka. I think most people choose to migrate to Australia, but some people choose the illegal way of doing this. Why do you think people resort to this method in your experience?
Maybe they don't think that they have any other option, and certainly not everybody is going to get a visa to go anywhere. That be it Australia, America, England, France, you name a country in the world which has a migration program, and most of them will. They all rely upon a person assimilating into the country, and if you don't have the ability to communicate, it does create a large problem.
Of course.
Many people don't have an English capability. Sri Lanka's a country that has a lot of English capability. As we've noticed, almost everybody here speaks, well, I shouldn't say everybody, that's a rather broad statement, but many people here.
They try, I guess.
In the professions,
yes,
definitely.
Yes,
a lot of the education here is in English. A lot of people have studied through the UK. So they have a degree from university either obtained via a third party in Sri Lanka through the UK, or they've been to the UK to study. So many people think that they don't have the ability to migrate when actually they do have the ability to migrate. They just haven't spoken to the right person.
So that's very important to keep that in mind. But of course now you might be knowing so many Sri Lankan professionals who have already migrated to Australia. They've settled down there. So in your opinion, what are the experiences that they are going through now? And how, I'm sure it's great for them there in Australia, but let's speak about a few professionals that you know of.
Well, look, anyone migrating anywhere is going to have certain issues settling into anywhere.
Of course.
Whether you move a suburb or 3 suburbs, when you go out of your locale, then it does cause some consternation at various points in time. The Sri Lankans in Australia actually make up about 0.4% of our total population. Given that the migration of Sri Lankans hasn't been that long, that's quite a large amount of Australia's population. I mentioned off-air that the English have about 4.2%, and given that they started a few hundred years ago,
and we started, what did you say, about 5 to 10 years
maybe
back?
20 years ago, I'm not quite sure of the time, but to have about 0.4% of the population
we catch up fast.
Means there's quite a lot of Sri Lankans in Australia, and they do quite well compared to the general population. Once again, we can refer to the immigration statistics which are on their website, and readily available data which I dragged off just to show people how Sri Lankans do in Australia. And certainly in terms of how they compete with other nationalities, Germans, the French, the Polish, the New Zealanders, or maybe not the New Zealanders because there's many more of those in Australia because of our agreements, how they compete between religions, for instance. So Australia's quite a diverse culture. And the statistics that the Immigration Department produce I think through the Australian Bureau of Statistics, show that to be Buddhist in Australia is not unusual. There's 1 million Buddhists in Australia, for instance. The driver on the way here said, "Do you have many temples and stuff in Australia?" I said, "Lots. We have lots of everything."
Really?
Yes, absolutely. And so with 1 million Buddhists around the place.
Many people before applying, they would have a reservation because they'd wonder how they'd be accepted by everyone, and that I think plays at the back of their minds all the time. So you're saying that this, although it's not just something that's completely not there, that the acceptance is when it comes to migrants is pretty high, and the tolerance and the diversity in the country.
Very much, and in my experience that is the case. Look, many years ago when I've been doing migration now for 18 years, we had a situation where there was a certain person who rode a wave of popularity on the anti-migrant issue. And that was very damaging to the country, particularly my travels into Indonesia at that time. Everybody was saying, why don't you like us? Why don't you like us? We're saying, heck, it's not us. We love you guys. Yes. It's just a certain section. And you can go anywhere in the world and you'll find a certain section of the population which is, I suppose, for want of a better word, a redneck. You can't get away from that. It's just part of the population mix.
I think Barack Obama might have something to say about that as well.
Yeah, maybe. Yes. But Sri Lankans in Australia, if we looked at the figures that I saw, certainly they are at least as educated as everybody else in terms of degrees and matter of fact, in some cases more educated than many people, including Australians, per head of population. Oh. Degrees, master's degrees, diplomas, these sorts of things. And in terms of income, well in the mix in terms of the income, between $20,000 to $75,000 per year. Now the $20,000 is usually the people who are part-timers or casual workers, but there's plenty of Sri Lankans out there earning in excess of $75,000 a year. And it just goes to show, and if you look across the board, it competes with every other nation whose people have migrated to Australia. So people shouldn't be thinking that they go there and they're not going to be able to find employment. You find employment by having a qualification, by being prepared to work. That's one of the criticisms that Australians in general, from Australians about Australians, is that sometimes because of our social network we tend, from the younger people, tend maybe not to want to work. But in every case I've seen where a migrant comes into the country, whether they're from Sri Lanka or, I don't know, France or whatever, they really want to make a future for themselves and for their family. And let's face it, nobody really wants to leave home. It's where your roots are, it's where your parents are, your relatives. You're familiar with the streets and the schools and the beaches and these sorts of things. But you leave home, most people, predominantly for their children. If they're in, well, a lot younger than me, of course, in their mid-30s, or people leave home or encourage their children to leave because they can see better futures for them, for their children. That's a general comment, I suppose. Maybe it doesn't always happen that way. But Sri Lankans... in general,
that is quite true. That is the case. And when it comes to professionals who leave for better work, better employment in the countries, they usually go with their families. So that we've spoken about children or youth going for higher education in Australia. But when they migrate with the family, how do the children get integrated into the educational system in Australia, especially at the primary and the secondary level?
That's a very good question. As a matter of fact, the beautiful thing about children is they don't have any barriers to anything. They will play with everybody, and that's the wonderful thing about children. I look at my grandchildren and I see, they don't have any conception of colour, of country. It's just you are.
So you play with me or my pal.
Yes, that's it. And that's the beautiful thing about it. In terms of getting into school, as a permanent resident, you have access to everything that my children or my grandchildren have access to. If you want to go to a private school, then you'll pay the same fee as my grandchildren will pay. If you enter a government school, each state has its own education program but controlled by the federal government. In Western Australia, for instance, if you migrate to Australia, you go to a public or a government school, I think the cost is probably $500 or $600 a year, and that's basically an amenities fee where you're paying for extra things that the school wants to provide. But the education is pretty much free. Buy your books and your uniforms and those sorts of things. They're not free. Different states have different requirements, but in the main, they're on par.
I see.
At secondary school, or what we would call the higher school and secondary high school, prior to university, same deal. You'll pay an amenities fee. You'll do your secondary education up to a total of 12 years at school, so grade 1 through to year 12, and then you'll move into a university or college if you wanted to go that far, or you might go to an apprenticeship and become a bricklayer or a carpenter or something along these lines, or not. You'll find an occupation somewhere else.
Of course, but Australia really is the land of opportunity. If you are willing to put the work in to make sure that you are there, that you go there by the correct process, and that you work hard, because actually the harder you work, the luckier you get. Isn't that the case?
This is my third trip here. for Australian Migration Services, and every time we've been here the response we have is quite incredible. And I'm really looking forward to getting on the plane, because since last Sunday we've been every day meeting people, and it's seeing some of the skills that the people of this country have. It's quite outstanding.
Wow,
quite
so that's
outstanding.
really great to hear from an expert on migration in Australia. So thank you so much, Mr. Peter Loughton, for being with us on the show this morning and for sharing your knowledge and expertise with all of our viewers. I'm sure that you learned a lot from that as well, and thank you once again.
Thank you for having me on your show.
All right, so have a safe journey back to Australia, and we'll be going for a very short break on Good Morning Sri Lanka right now, but don't go anywhere. We'll be right back.